After years of sacrificing my life to raise my siblings, driving them to school, paying their bills, and covering for our parents, they turned around and said, "You're nothing to us anymore." I sat there in shock until I finally decided to show them what their life looks like without me. I, 32M, never planned to become a parent at 19. But when your mother walks out and your father decides whiskey is more important than his kids, you don't really get a choice. The day she left, I was supposed to start college. Full scholarship to study engineering, dorm room already assigned, bags packed. Instead, I was standing in our kitchen at 6 in the morning, making breakfast for 3 terrified kids who kept asking when mom was coming back. My youngest sibling was only 4 years old then. The middle one was 7. The oldest of the 3 was 9. They looked at me like I had answers. I didn't go to college that fall, or the next one, or ever. Those first years were brutal. I picked up 2 jobs, one at a warehouse during the day, another stocking shelves at night. I learned to cook by watching YouTube videos on my cracked phone screen. I learned to braid hair, sign permission slips, and explain why Dad couldn't make it to parent-teacher conferences. I became fluent in lies that protected them from the truth, that our father was usually passed out by 7, and our mother had started a new family 3 states away. I drove them everywhere. School, doctor's appointments, friends' houses, birthday parties. My beat-up Honda became a second home. I'd wait in parking lots doing inventory counts on my laptop, catching 20-minute naps between drop-offs and pickups. I missed my own birthday 4 years in a row because it always fell during midterms or science fairs or some crisis that needed handling. The bills never stopped. Rent, utilities, groceries, school supplies, medical expenses, car insurance, phone bills. I paid for everything. Dad's disability check barely covered his own needs, and even that was generous. Most of it went to the liquor store. I worked myself into exhaustion, took on extra shifts, learned to stretch a dollar until it screamed. I covered for our parents constantly. When teachers asked about Mom, I'd smile and say she was working overseas. When coaches wondered why Dad never showed up, I'd explain he had a bad back and couldn't sit on bleachers. I became an expert at fabricating normalcy, at making sure nobody looked too closely at our situation. The alternative was foster care, split up, strangers raising them. I couldn't let that happen. 13 years. That's how long I did this. 13 years of putting my life on hold, of watching friends move away and build careers and fall in love while I stayed in the same apartment, working the same dead-end jobs, making sure 3 kids I didn't birth had everything they needed. And they thrived. The youngest got into a prestigious university with a pre-med track. The middle one earned a full ride for athletics to a state school. The oldest started at a community college and was already talking about transferring to finish a business degree. I was so proud I could barely breathe sometimes. 3 months ago, we all gathered for Sunday dinner. It had become our tradition, the one time each month when everyone came home. I'd spent the morning cooking their favorite foods, cleaning the apartment until it shined, excited to hear about their lives. The youngest arrived first, barely looking up from their phone. The middle one showed up an hour late. The oldest came with their partner, someone I'd never met despite them dating for 6 months. We sat around the table, and I asked about classes, about games, about internships. I got one-word answers and impatient sighs. Then the oldest cleared their throat and said they needed to talk to me about something. The other 2 suddenly paid attention, and I realized this was planned, rehearsed. They discussed this without me. The oldest explained that they'd been talking, and they felt it was time for some boundaries. They were adults now, building their own lives, and they needed space to figure out who they were without me hovering. The middle one jumped in, saying I was too involved, too controlling, always checking in and asking questions. The youngest nodded along, adding that they appreciated everything I'd done, but it was time for me to focus on my own life now. I sat there, fork halfway to my mouth, trying to process. I asked what they meant by boundaries. The oldest said they'd prefer if I didn't call or text unless it was an emergency. The middle one said they'd reach out when they had time, but I shouldn't expect weekly updates anymore. The youngest said Sunday dinners were becoming an obligation rather than something they enjoyed, so maybe we should make them less frequent. I asked if I'd done something wrong. They exchanged glances, and the oldest said this wasn't about me. It was about them needing independence. I reminded them I'd never stopped them from being independent. I'd encouraged it, paid for it, sacrificed everything to make it possible. The middle one's expression hardened, and they said that was exactly the problem. I was always bringing up what I'd done, making them feel guilty, using my sacrifices as leverage. Something cold settled in my chest. I asked if that's really what they thought, that I'd spent 13 years raising them just to hold it over their heads. The youngest shifted uncomfortably and said nobody asked me to do all that. They would have been fine. Maybe foster care wouldn't have been so bad. At least then they wouldn't owe anyone anything. The words hung in the air like poison. I looked at each of them, these people I'd clothed and fed and loved, searching for some recognition of how insane that statement was. The oldest wouldn't meet my eyes. The middle one stared at their plate. The youngest just shrugged. I asked if they remembered what it was like before. Did they remember eating cereal for dinner 3 nights in a row because Dad forgot to buy groceries? Did they remember wearing shoes with holes because there was no money for new ones? Did they remember the time our power got shut off in January and we slept in our coats? The oldest said those were just stories I told to make myself look like a hero. They barely remembered most of it. So how bad could it really have been? I stood up from the table. My hands were shaking. I told them they were right. I didn't need to focus on my own life. And I was going to start immediately. The middle one asked what that meant, and I said it meant exactly what they'd asked for. Boundaries. Space. Independence. They could figure things out on their own now, just like they wanted. The youngest laughed nervously and said I was overreacting. The oldest said I was being childish. I walked to the door and held it open. I told them Sunday dinner was over, and they should leave. They left, confused and irritated. The oldest said I'd calm down in a few days. The door closed behind them, and I stood in my apartment. The same apartment I'd kept for 13 years because it was big enough for all of us, in the school district they needed, and I started making plans. The first thing I did was cancel the phone plan. They were all on my family plan, had been since they got their first phones. I called the provider Monday morning and removed them, effective immediately. I kept my number and switched to a single line. Next was the car insurance. All 3 had cars now, used vehicles I'd helped them buy and had kept on my policy because it was cheaper than them getting their own. I called and removed them from my coverage. They'd need to figure out their own insurance. I'd been sending money monthly to each of them, spending money for groceries, gas, emergencies, whatever they needed. The youngest got $800 a month. The middle one got $600. The oldest got $500 because they had a part-time job. I stopped all the transfers. The apartment lease was up for renewal in 2 months. I'd stayed in this place because it was their home, the only stable thing they'd known. But I didn't need 3 bedrooms. I gave notice and started looking for a studio across town, somewhere cheaper, somewhere that was just mine. I went through my files and pulled out every document with their names on it. Birth certificates, social security cards, medical records, school transcripts. I packed them in a box with a note explaining that since they were independent adults now, they should keep their own paperwork. I shipped it to the oldest's apartment. The first call came 3 days later. The youngest, panicking because their phone didn't work. They'd tried calling me from a friend's phone, voice high and confused, asking what happened. I explained calmly that they were adults now and needed their own phone plan. They sputtered something about not having money for that, and I suggested they figure it out like other adults do. They hung up angry. The middle one called next, using the oldest's phone. Their car insurance had lapsed, and they'd gotten pulled over. The ticket was expensive, and now they couldn't drive until they had coverage. They demanded to know why I'd removed them without warning. I asked if they'd given me warning before announcing they wanted nothing to do with me. Silence. Then they said this was different. This was practical stuff. I told them practical stuff was part of being an independent adult. They called me petty and hung up. The oldest showed up at my apartment a week later. They'd received the box of documents and wanted to know what my problem was. I invited them in, offered coffee, acted completely calm. They refused the coffee and said I was being ridiculous. The younger 2 were struggling, their phone situation was a mess, and the middle one might lose their scholarship if they couldn't get to practice. I listened, nodded, and said that sounded stressful. They should help their siblings figure it out. The oldest stared at me and asked if I was serious. I said I'd never been more serious. They'd made it clear I was too involved, so I was stepping back like they'd asked. They said I knew that wasn't what they meant. I asked what they did mean then. What exactly did they want from me? The oldest struggled to answer. Finally, they said they just wanted me to stop acting like their parent, stop being so intense about everything. I laughed, actually laughed, and said that was fascinating. They wanted me to stop acting like their parent, but continue funding their lives like one. They wanted the money and support without the relationship. The oldest's face flushed, and they said that wasn't fair. I asked what about any of this had been fair. They left without another word. Update 1. It's been 6 weeks since that Sunday dinner. The apartment is mostly packed now. I've gotten rid of so much stuff. Furniture they'd used, decorations from birthdays and holidays, photo albums I'd carefully maintained. I kept a few pictures for myself, but most of it went to donation or trash. Erasing 13 years of their presence from my space felt both painful and liberating. The youngest showed up at my work last week. I don't know how they got there without a car. Maybe they borrowed one. Maybe they took a bus. They waited outside until my shift ended, and when I walked to my car, they stepped in front of me. Their eyes were red, and they asked if we could talk. I said I had plans, which was true. I'd started going to the gym, finally taking care of myself. They said this would only take a minute. I unlocked my car and told them they had 30 seconds. They broke down almost immediately. Everything was falling apart. Without the money I'd been sending, they couldn't afford groceries and textbooks. They tried to get a job, but between pre-med course load and studying, there weren't enough hours. Their roommate was getting annoyed because they couldn't cover their share of utilities. They'd tried calling Dad for help, and he'd laughed before hanging up. They'd even tried Mom, and her new husband said she couldn't help with kids from her previous life. They asked if I understood how scared they were. I said yes, I did understand. I'd been that scared at 19, except I'd also had 3 children depending on me. They flinched like I'd slapped them. They said they were sorry. They didn't mean what they'd said at dinner. They were just stressed and took it out on me. I asked if they were sorry they'd said it, or sorry they were facing consequences. They insisted they were really sorry, that they loved me, that they needed me. I asked where this love had been when they'd told me I was nothing to them anymore. They claimed they never said that. I pulled out my phone and played a recording. I'd started recording our conversations after years of them misremembering or denying things, a habit I'd developed when dealing with Dad's gaslighting. Their own voice came through the speaker, saying those exact words. You're nothing to us anymore. We need to move on. Their face went pale. They stammered that they'd been angry, that people say things they don't mean. I said that was true, but sometimes those things reveal what people really think. I got in my car. They stood there crying, and I drove away. In my rearview mirror, I watched them sink to the curb, head in their hands. I felt nothing but a distant ache, like watching a stranger suffer. The middle one tried a different approach. They went to my workplace and spoke to my manager, claiming there was a family emergency and they needed to reach me urgently. My manager, concerned, gave them my new number. I'd changed it 2 weeks earlier. When they called, they skipped the apologies and went straight to anger. I'd ruined everything. Their scholarship was in jeopardy because they'd missed practices due to transportation issues. Their coach was losing patience. They'd had to drop a class because they couldn't afford the required materials. This was all my fault for being vindictive and cruel. I listened until they ran out of steam, then asked if they remembered what they'd said about foster care. How it wouldn't have been so bad. How at least then they wouldn't owe anyone anything. Long silence. Then I asked if they understood what foster care actually meant. Separated. Different homes. Likely different schools. No guarantee they'd see each other again. Aging out at 18 with nothing and no one. I'd prevented that. I'd kept them together, kept them safe, gave them chances I never had. And they'd thrown it in my face. The middle one's voice cracked. They said they'd been stupid, immature. I agreed and hung up. The oldest has been the most persistent. They've sent emails, letters, shown up at my old apartment before realizing I'd moved. They've tried to frame this as a misunderstanding that got out of hand. According to them, nobody meant for things to go this far. They just wanted a normal relationship, not this war. I finally responded to one email with a detailed breakdown of every expense I'd covered for each of them over 13 years. Rent, utilities, food, clothing, school expenses, medical costs, transportation, insurance, entertainment, technology, birthday, and Christmas gifts. The total for all 3 of them combined was over $400,000. I wasn't asking for repayment. I'd never expected it. But I wanted them to see, in concrete numbers, what hovering and being too involved had actually meant. I ended the email by saying they'd gotten exactly what they'd asked for, a life without me in it. I wished them well and blocked their email address. My coworkers have noticed I seem different. Lighter somehow. I've started taking my full lunch breaks instead of working through them. I joined a recreational basketball league. I went on a date. Nothing serious, but the first one in over a decade. I'm sleeping better than I have in years. But there are hard moments. I'll see something one of them would like and instinctively reach for my phone to send a picture. I'll cook dinner and accidentally make too much, forgetting I'm only feeding myself now. I'll have good news and realize I have nobody to share it with. The loneliness is different than before, cleaner, somehow. Before, I was lonely while surrounded by people who took me for granted. Now I'm lonely but free. Update 2. 2 months since that dinner. I moved into my studio apartment last week. It's small, just enough space for me, in a neighborhood where I don't know anyone. I bought new furniture, nothing fancy, but mine. Picked out colors I liked. Hung pictures I wanted to see. Made it a home that has nothing to do with anyone else. Dad called yesterday. This was shocking because we hadn't spoken in almost 3 years. His voice was rough, older than I remembered. He asked if I knew the kids were struggling. I said I'd heard something about that. He had the audacity to tell me I was being too hard on them. They were just kids who made a mistake. I asked how old I'd been when I became responsible for those kids. 19, he admitted quietly. And how old were they now? I pressed. 22, 19, and 21. All older than I'd been. He tried to argue it was different. I'd always been mature, responsible. I cut him off. I'd been a teenager forced to grow up because the adults in my life failed. They were actual adults choosing to reject someone who'd sacrificed everything for them. He was silent for a long moment, then said maybe I was right. Then he asked if I'd consider helping them anyway, for his sake. I laughed bitterly and asked what he'd ever done for my sake. He had no answer. I told him to lose my number and hung up. The youngest sent a letter to my new address. I don't know how they got it. Maybe through work, maybe they hired someone to find me. The letter was 7 pages long, handwritten, tear-stained. They went through memory after memory. The time I'd stayed up all night helping with a science project. The time I'd worked a double shift to afford their class trip. The time I'd talked them through a panic attack before a big exam. Every soccer game, every school play, every milestone I'd been there for. They wrote that they'd been taking inventory of their life and realized I was woven through every good thing in it. Every opportunity, every success, every moment of stability. I'd made it possible. They said they'd been selfish and cruel and stupid. They said they understood if I never forgave them, but they needed me to know that they saw it now. They saw everything I'd done. They saw what they'd thrown away. The letter ended with a simple plea. Please. Just please. I read it 3 times. Then I put it in a drawer. Maybe someday I'll respond. Maybe not. The wounds are too fresh, and I'm tired of being the one who always bends first. The middle one lost their scholarship. Without reliable transportation and missing too many practices, the coach cut them from the team. They had to withdraw from school because they couldn't afford tuition without the athletic money. I heard this through a former neighbor who ran into them at a grocery store. They're working retail now, living back at Dad's place, trying to save money to return to school next year. The neighbor said they looked lost. The oldest's relationship ended. Apparently, their partner got tired of the drama and constant stress. They're struggling to balance work and classes, falling behind in both. They had to sell their car to pay bills and are taking buses now. They're getting a taste of what I lived for 13 years, except they only have to worry about themselves. I should feel vindicated. Maybe I do a little, but mostly I feel sad. Sad for all of us, for what we could have been if they'd just appreciated what we had. I gave them everything, and they treated it like nothing. Now they have nothing, and they finally understand the difference. I've started therapy. My therapist asked if I felt guilty about cutting them off. I said no. She asked if I missed them. I said yes. She asked if those feelings contradicted each other. I said I didn't think they did. You can miss people and still know that keeping them in your life would destroy you. Last night, I sat in my new apartment, eating dinner I'd cooked just for myself, watching a show I'd picked, and I realized something. For the first time since I was 19 years old, I'm living my life. Not the life I inherited, not the life I was forced into, but mine. It's smaller than I'd once dreamed. I'm starting over at 32 with nothing but my freedom. But it's mine. They taught me that blood doesn't guarantee loyalty, and sacrifice doesn't guarantee gratitude. I taught them that some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt. Maybe someday we'll find our way back to each other. Maybe we won't. Either way, I'm done sacrificing myself for people who don't value the sacrifice. I'm finally living for me, and that's going to have to be enough.